When alt season, every cycle has a rhythm. And if history is right, we're headed straight into the final act. Our guest today is Ben Cowen, the founder of Into the Cryptoverse and one of the most respected analysts in the space. He has a PhD in nuclear engineering with a background in computational modeling. And that's why his signals matter and why I wanted him on right now. He says the data is screaming the same thing it always does right before a cycle top.
Normally, cycles end in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? So that's coming up relatively soon. If you look at, the last few cycles, this was the fourth quarter of 2013, the fourth quarter of 2017, and then the fourth quarter of 2021. And so it at least stands to reason that we might have a top sometime, in the fourth quarter of the year.
So there it is. Ben thinks Q4 is where the fireworks hit. But this cycle has a twist because while Bitcoin's been grinding higher, retail, they really haven't showed up.
Retail never really came back. That doesn't mean we don't have retail investors. We just have the same retail investors for the most part that we had back 4 years ago. A lot of this cycle seems to be more like, you could argue ETF driven, institutionally driven.
That's exactly what's playing out right now. Wall Street is carrying this market while the average investor stays sidelined. And before we get to alt season, Ben says there's one more rotation. And it isn't the one most people expect.
I think people are missing a step. I think so. It was Bitcoin to ETH, right? So and now, right now, you're getting...
I'll make you guys watch to find out, but that's the move that lights the fuse for the parabolic altcoin runs everyone's waiting for. And if you're betting October is when alts take off, well, guys, Ben has a different read.
When you look at Bitcoin dominance, normally it reverses course in the month of September, and then for it to explode higher in October. And so that's the reason why I still think the alt season calls are premature.
So if October is setting up as Bitcoin's month, when alt season, guys, here's the hard truth. Historically, the real alt season doesn't arrive until one key event triggers it. And Ben lays it out clearly.
In order to get an alt season, like what people remember as alt season back in like late 2017, late 2021, is you need...
Today, Ben reveals his full playbook for how this cycle plays out and how he's positioning to maximize profits. So guys, without further ado, let's bring on the man, the myth, the legend, Benjamin Cowen. Ben, welcome back to the show. Good to have you here. How's it going? And first question is, where are we in this market? It feels like one of the most boring bull markets we've ever seen, but just curious, generally speaking, where are we right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here as always. This has been somewhat of a boring cycle, I think. I think mainly it's felt boring because a lot of altcoins haven't really participated as much as, like what people remember. But since the last time we spoke, we at least now have Ethereum participating. I think last time we spoke, Ethereum was, nowhere to be found, right, in terms of even flirting with the all-time high. So we've seen Ethereum join in. I can at least share my screen and perhaps give some insight into where I think we are.
Sure.
But it's really anyone's guess. I mean, when I think about the cycles, I think about a lot of repetitive behavior. And if you look at like the ROI from the low, this cycle is getting potentially close to the end. Normally cycles end in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? So that's coming up relatively soon. If you look at, the last few cycles, this was the fourth quarter of 2013, the fourth quarter of 2017, and then the fourth quarter of 2021. And so, I mean, it at least stands, and look, nothing's a sure thing, right? No one actually knows what's going to happen, but it at least stands to reason that we might have a top sometime, in the fourth quarter of the year. And of course, it sort of, raises the question, well, what about altcoins, right? When are altcoins going to participate, or are they going to participate? Normally, when you do get an alt season, that's usually a sign that the cycle's over, right? So by the time you get that, it usually means that the Bitcoin's bull market is over. I think one of the other reasons why this one has felt a lot more boring is also because we have diminishing returns from one cycle to another, right? Like every cycle gives us slightly smaller returns. It's still great returns. I mean, Bitcoin, started the cycle at 15K and now it's already hit 124. You're already talking about a 7 to 8x move from the low, which for the stock market, that would be a great return over 3 years. But I think a lot of people in crypto are, they're so accustomed to chasing those higher gains. And it's been a more boring cycle because a lot of the gains, the gains to be had were just in Bitcoin. And I think that's kind of the hard part about this cycle. It's mostly been a Bitcoin maxi cycle for the most part, with a few exceptions. We've seen some altcoins do well, but yeah, that's where I think we are. I mean, and also one other thing, when you look at how cycles finish, what normally happens is you get a local top in August and then a local low in September, and then you go into the market cycle top, right? So in 2021, we set a high here, like in late August, early September. We then set the local low in late September, and then we went into the market cycle top in Q4. Same thing in 2017, right? We set a high in August, a low in September, and then the market cycle top was in Q4. Same thing in 2013, a high in August, a low in September, and then the market cycle top in Q4. And so when you look at this cycle, you actually can see that it's the same thing, right? I mean, you have a high in August, a low in September, and there's a good chance the low for September is already in. If it's not, then it could go a little bit lower, and then potentially going up into whatever the final top is. I think it would be prudent as an investor to at least entertain the idea that 2026 will see Bitcoin retracing some, and then hopefully just gearing up for another good year in 2027. It's just kind of the way the cycles worked, and I still subscribe to the idea if it's not broke, don't try to fix it.
Yeah. So, okay. So, but what about, I'll get into that a little bit more in just a second, but what about the altcoins? Do we think that, do we think that if we continue to go higher in this Q4 that we're going to get retail coming back and we're going to get, or, I know that you're mostly into charts, but are we just seeing like not enough capital in the retail markets to give us an altcoin season, or people broke, or what's going on?
Well, I think one of the reasons this cycle feels different too is because a lot of the retail investors that people keep talking, to some degree we are retail investors, right? But like in order to see more retail investors come in, like we're not seeing that. This is this chart shows the social risk, and you can see like this kind of explains how everyone's feeling, right? Like everyone feels like this cycle sucks. And one of the reasons is because you don't really have a lot of new participants. This orange line, basically when it's up high, it shows that like retail is flooding in. And when it's down low, it shows that like retail really doesn't care. And we're now almost in Q4 of the post-halving year, and retail never really came back. That doesn't mean we don't have retail investors. We just have the same retail investors for the most part that we had back 4 years ago. A lot of this cycle seems to be more like, you could argue ETF driven, institutionally driven. And I've been a big believer that one way you could get retail to potentially come back, and again, there's no guarantees, but a lot of people, while we cheer on Bitcoin, and I've been the sort of the Bitcoin dominant strain for a long time, but while a lot of people watch Bitcoin, a lot of people that like watch YouTube and whatnot, they actually have larger positions in altcoins than in Bitcoin. So even if Bitcoin were to go up to like 150K, a lot of retail investors aren't going to care because they don't actually own Bitcoin, right? They want to see their altcoins go up. I think one of the things that you're watching right now, or that's worth watching, is Ethereum. Because what I've sort of thought for a while is that in order to get an alt season, like what people remember as alt season back in like late 2017, late 2021, is you need Ethereum to really durably break to new all-time highs, right? I think that's what you need. And I said for a while that the path for Ethereum to get there this cycle is that, it would first go to its lower regression band, right, which it did back in April. Then it would go to new all-time highs. But on the first attempt of the all-time highs, it would actually get rejected. And I think that's what's causing that those alt season calls to remain premature is because you're still not looking at an Ethereum that is sustaining new all-time highs.
Right.
You could still see Ethereum wick above 5K, but I still am a strong believer in the idea that until Ethereum tags this 21-week EMA, it could be now at 3,600, or it could be 3 weeks from now at a higher price, maybe closer to 4K. But I still am a believer in the idea that you need Ethereum to sort of check back in, kind of like it did over here in June, right? You see how it checked back in with it, and then it just exploded higher. I think ultimately that's what's going to happen for Ethereum, is at some point over the next, say, 3 to 4 weeks, it will check in with that 20-week SMA or the 21-week EMA, and then go into its own rally into the market cycle top. And by the way, the same thing's happened every cycle, right? I mean, look at 2021. Ethereum checked in with that moving average in September, late September, early October. Same thing in 2017. Also the same thing in 2020 in September. So that doesn't mean that Bitcoin necessarily has to get as large of a correction. I think Bitcoin already did get a large correction. I mean, look at Bitcoin. It already dropped to its 20-week moving average, right? It already dropped down there. But I think you're going to see Ethereum eventually do the same thing. I think it's going to scare some people. And then hopefully after that, it can get a stronger rally out of that. And then the last thing I'll say before we go on to the next question is, when you look at Bitcoin dominance, normally it reverses course in the month of September, right? So like if you look at like September 2020, dominance was at the same level, and then it went up into Q4. If you look at September of 2017, dominance also bottomed in September and then went up into Q4. And so that's the reason why I still think the alt season calls are premature, because I think Bitcoin dominance is going to get another rally here late September and through the month of October. And so, if we get an alt season this cycle, my guess is that it won't happen until after October, if we're going to get one, right? I think it'll be after October, because again, I don't think you can get an alt season without a durable all-time high by Ethereum. And I don't think you're going to get a durable all-time high for Ethereum until, October, right? So that's kind of the way I see things playing out.
I was looking at your X account earlier, and I scrolled down. I think it was like last week or something like that. Maybe you posted the Bitcoin dominance. I think it was like a heat map or something like that. I don't know if it was on CoinGlass, but I thought that it seemed like Bitcoin dominance dropped in October typically.
So yeah, so it was on the website. So monthly returns, and basically the idea is we're going to look at metrics. So we're going to look at Bitcoin dominance. So what you'll notice is in October, Bitcoin dominance normally goes up, right? So like in 2024, dominance went up 5%. 2023, dominance went up 8%. So the average move of Bitcoin dominance in October is about 5%. In fact, dominance tends to go up the most in the month of October.
Okay. That's November, then it's red, right?
It's November that it typically is red.
Okay.
So I'm looking for dominance to really concretely form a low in September, and the low could very well already be in for dominance, and then for it to explode higher in October, and then I could see it then falling in the month of November. So
you're like, do you have any other kind of rationale behind the, other than if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of logic, for why we likely will have this cycle come to an end at the end of the year? You got guys like Raoul Pal and Arthur Hayes talking about how things like the liquidity injection that's coming from all the stimulus, or from the increased debt ceiling, but a beautiful bill, Fed cutting rates over the next year, these kind of tailwinds that they believe potentially would draw out the cycle in 2026. You don't see that happening. What are your thoughts there?
So, I mean, it's possible that certain cryptocurrencies could go up in 2026. Like, I mean, if you look at the 2017 cycle, Bitcoin topped in Q4, but Ethereum actually did not top until January of 2026. And then there were altcoins that continued to do well even through like April, just like last cycle. Like we saw Luna doing really, really well into 2022, but it still, I mean, it ended up, we know it eventually happened, right? So it's possible that some parts of the market could do well. even into 2026, especially those that maybe didn't do as well. The coins that were, didn't really participate as much so far. It's possible, but I I think there is a decent chance that the top will occur in 2025. If it doesn't, I'm fine with that. I mean, normally what I do is if I hold any altcoins, I at least consolidate the altcoins back to Bitcoin before the midterm year, or sometime early on in the midterm year, because even if I have to weather the Bitcoin bear market, Bitcoin normally gets to all-time highs before altcoins do. And
Yeah.
like, this cycle, proved that again. But I think the reasoning for it, like if there could be a couple of things, right? One reason could be that long end rates, like long end of the yield curve, could go higher as we go into 2026, and I think that could have negative effects on the cryptocurrency market. If you look at the 10-year yield, it really went up a lot after the Fed cut rates last year. I think a lot of people think that the Fed cutting rates means that the long end goes down. But, the Fed cut rates here in September 2024, and right after that, the long end, the 10-year yield went from 3.6% all the way up to like 4.8. And I think if the long end, my base case for the 10-year is that it's going to at least sweep that high from October 2023 before the business cycle, potentially comes to an end. So that could be one catalyst. The other thing to watch out for, and it still hasn't been an issue, and it still might not be. But we saw the labor market, again, we haven't really seen layoffs pick up. Initial claims did go up a little bit this past week, but it's just one data point. Hopefully that goes away, because going into that type of move where you see like layoffs picking up, that's not fun for anyone.
No.
And that would be kind of brutal. But if you look at like the unemployment rate, you can see that it is starting to move higher. And usually when the unemployment rate starts to move up, that's when Bitcoin then pulls back some, right? So if you were to just like overlay Bitcoin with the unemployment rate, you'll see that a lot of the longer consolidation periods this cycle coincided to when the unemployment rate was heading higher, because it was like that uncertainty, you could argue, that sort of led to some of those pullbacks. So if you look here, you can see that the unemployment rate in 2024, right, it started to go up right here.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when Bitcoin was, struggling, right? And then over here, when the unemployment rate was going up, that was when Bitcoin was struggling a little bit. So if the unemployment rate starts to go higher in 2026, I could see that being a thing. But remember, the good news is that even if we do have a bear market next year, the good news is that with diminishing returns normally comes diminishing losses, right? Mm-hmm. So the drawdown, if there is one, it shouldn't be as bad as prior cycles. I mean, I would expect maybe like a 70% drop plus or minus 5%. And the reason I say that is because if you just go through all of the history of Bitcoin, and that's from whatever the top is, right? I'm not saying it has to be from that level today, right? It's whatever the top is. But if you just go through the history of these Bitcoin bear markets, the first one was about a 94% drawdown. The next one was about 87%. The next one was about 84%. And then the last one was about 77%. So you can see they're getting a little bit more manageable. So yeah. I would say maybe a 70% drawdown from whatever the all-time high ends up being is reasonable. Again, does it have to happen? No, but history would at least caution us to at least believe that it might.
I heard you mention the business cycle, and one of the other guests that was really big on that was Henrik Zeberg. When he's really kind of leaning into that, he thinks that that's what he's paying attention to, thinking that we're going to come into kind of an everything bubble collapse in the next 2 months or so. What are your thoughts on kind of the business cycle versus kind of the 4-year Bitcoin cycle?
Yeah, it's tough to time that stuff because, like, you could have called for a recession every year for the last 4 years and it still hasn't happened, right? And one of the indicators that would even suggest that it could, it could happen in 2026. Like, I'm not going to say that it can't, but one of the really interesting metrics this cycle has been the comparisons with the .com era business cycle. But not necessarily. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the S&P 500 divided by the money supply, this cycle is mapping the dot-com cycle perfectly. And it kind of makes sense because, during the dot-com era, we had internet companies. No one knew how the internet was going to change everything. And now no one knows how AI is going to affect everything. But this metric, while comparing it with the dot-com obviously sounds bad, but we know what ended up happening. But if you look at it, the move that the S&P divided by M2 had starting from 1996 into the peak, it's almost an identical move. Like if you take it from the low here, right? Like even that 20% drop right there is nearly identical, right? Like it's almost, so you sort of have this move first, right? You get that drawdown, and then so that's like a 10% drop. Then you get the 20% drop, right? And that's what we got in April, right? That's what sent Ethereum to the regression band. Now, if you look at this, you could see how there could be a correction into early 2026, right? Because this here would be early 2026. But there is a chance that the music continues to play, right, for a while longer. And maybe the business cycle doesn't actually end until, say, 2027 or 2028, right? Like, no one actually knows. Again, this chart would suggest that it could go on longer. So if you made me play devil's advocate against the 4-year cycle, I would say, well, Bitcoin moves a lot closer with the NASDAQ and the S&P today than it ever has in the past. Therefore, maybe things could, play out differently. But I feel like at the current time, I'm going to have to just go with, look, you're probably going to have a bear market for crypto next year. If anything can hold on next year and do well, it'll probably be Bitcoin, right? Like if you told me, if you could only pick one cryptocurrency to do the best in 2026, which one would it be? I'd probably say Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So my strategy, what I would say is by the end of this year or January at the absolute latest, history would say it's a good idea to get out of altcoins, at least, right? Yeah. At least. And that way, if there is a Bitcoin bear market, so be it. Normally Bitcoin's able to get back up to all-time highs first. So yeah, like I think the business cycle will come to an end. My guess is it's going to happen sometime, during the current administration, right? That's my guess, like sometime over the next like three years or so. And I also don't really see it as something necessarily caused by the current administration. I think it's, it's kind of like all the money printing we had, last cycle, like back in 2020, that led to inflation, right? Like that inflation was going to happen no matter who took office in 2021.
Right.
But you could also now argue that the unemployment rate going higher now or going higher into 2026, like it was always going to happen no matter who took office, right? It's just a lot of times administrations like to pass off their problems to the next one, right? Yeah. So yeah, I do think the business cycle will come to an end, but the good news about business cycles coming to an end is it's normally like a 12 to 18 month process, right? So like when markets bottom, it's an event, right? It's a single event. Mm-hmm. When markets top, it's a process, right? It's a long process where we go down, the bulls try again, and we're still not at the point where we're not even seeing lower highs yet, right? We're still at all-time highs. So yeah, the business cycle is a process. That's at least the way that you can try to stay optimistic, is to just remember that when things are truly over, there likely will be signs for months, right, of the market dropping and then lower highs. Because the only way you go into the end of the business cycle, right, where you get a recession, is to first start to see lower asset prices that scare people, right, that scare employers, so they want to lay people off. And that's the reason why, when the S&P dropped over here, a lot of people thought that was a recession, but the reason it's not is because asset prices recovered. I even made a video on it at the time. I said, look, guys, if asset prices recover back up to all-time highs within a couple of months, like they did in 1998, then you're still not going to have a recession, right? The way you have a recession is you get lower asset prices that don't recover, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things where like everyone wants to be the hero and call for the top and call for the recession. But until asset prices start durably going down, it's hard to actually have a recession, right? Because the incentives to lay people off just aren't necessarily there yet. And that's not just my opinion. I mean, like look at layoffs, right? I know people think this is a bad labor market, and hires are down, but the layoffs are still, if anything, they're still below the pre-pandemic levels, you know? So the right now the labor market is still holding up, but within another year or two, at some point, things have got to start breaking down.
That makes sense. I've seen people recently calling for kind of the next rotation from ETH to other majors. Do you think that we're at that point yet?
So I think people are missing a step. I think so. It was Bitcoin to ETH, right? So and when Ethereum went to its regression band back in April, that was the time to trade things in for Ethereum, because you can actually see that altcoins bled over 50% against Ethereum after Ethereum went down to $1,300, $1,400 back in April. So that was your sort of Ethereum season. Now, right now, you sort of got a taste of what an alt season might be like, where you're starting to see alts rally against Ethereum. But the only reason they're rallying against Ethereum right now is because usually after Ethereum sweeps a prior high, or not just Ethereum, just when assets sweep a prior high, they can then correct for a little bit, like a few weeks, sometimes a few months, and you're seeing alts rally against Ethereum. What I think people are missing right now, when they keep calling for alt season, I think they're missing an intermediate rotation back to Bitcoin first, right? So it was Bitcoin only basically until April, because Bitcoin dominance was just going up, right? It really went up until June, but Ethereum bottomed in April against Bitcoin. So it was basically Bitcoin only, then Bitcoin and Ethereum since April. And then I think a lot of people think it's alt season now, but I don't think it's alt season until Ethereum puts in durable all-time highs. And I don't think it's going to do that until October at the earliest, which means that we're not witnessing a rotation right now to the other majors. We're witnessing a rotation back to Bitcoin. And it should be a timely rotation, because we already saw that October is normally the best month for Bitcoin dominance, right? October is the best month. We've seen dominance bottom in September, like 5 or 6 of the years that Bitcoin that we've even tracked this stuff. So I think that rotation will likely come, but I think people are off by about 2 months on that call. I think we're going to first get a Bitcoin rotation back. That rotation will probably last us for the rest of this month, and then through all of October, and then maybe early November. But by the time you're getting to mid-November, you're probably getting that rotation you talked about.
So how are you currently positioned yourself in your portfolio from Bitcoin and altcoins and ETH to majors?
So if you look at like this modern portfolio theory stuff, and you want to like maximize your risk adjusted returns, generally speaking, to maximize your Sortino ratio, you're looking around 83% Bitcoin, 17% ETH, right? So about 80-20, plus or minus, I think is the way to go. That way, especially right now, because if you're banking on Bitcoin dominance going up again, which is what I think is going to happen, it makes sense to have most of your crypto portfolio in Bitcoin, right? Because it's lower risk than alts, and it should outperform most of them for the next 6 weeks. But about 20% into ETH, because while I do think it's going to struggle against Bitcoin for maybe a few more weeks, as measured from now until the end of the cycle, Ethereum will likely outperform Bitcoin, right? As measured from now until the end, even though I expect weakness through the month of October for the ETH Bitcoin pair. So I think right now about an 80 to 20% split, Bitcoin and ETH makes the most amount of sense. If you are going to go into altcoins right now, I would still keep it a relatively low amount, just because I see that rotation back to Bitcoin coming.
And so then would you say that, I mean, for you, or just generally speaking, do you think then kind of at the end of October would be the good time to start rotating into kind of alts on the majors?
Well, it depends on what your unit of account is, right? I mean, and this is where I get into trouble with people, is because a lot of people will sit there with cash and they'll hear me say like, oh, Ben says don't get into altcoins. But what I'm actually saying is being in Bitcoin makes more sense, right? So if your unit of account is US dollars and you want to get into altcoins, I think just DCA, right, is the way. It's kind of foolish to try to time the market too much, because no one can really time the market, in my opinion. But if your unit of account is Bitcoin, that's been a lot easier to track this cycle, right? It's been a lot easier to just know when Bitcoin tends to outperform. So if you're looking to rotate, then I would say stay with Bitcoin for now, and then maybe early November rotate. But that's it. That's if your unit account's Bitcoin. If your unit account is US dollars, I think DCA is the way.
Do you have any idea potentially how high the total market cap might go and this cycle? Any theories on that?
That's a good question. Let me see. I haven't really looked at it a whole lot. I guess if you kind of extend this out, I mean, I think someone asked me this like a week or two ago, and I feel like 5 to 6 trillion is obtainable. You would essentially need to have Bitcoin at all-time highs, Ethereum participating, and altcoins starting to participate. If you look at like last cycle and you look at this like fib extension from the top, you can see that we rallied up to the 4.236 from the cycle before. So if you kind of extend that out, you can see that the 1.618, we're getting relatively close to it. That would correspond to about 4.5 trillion or so, maybe about 4.4. So there's a decent chance we'll reach that. The next level is a 2.618, which is all the way up at just over 6 trillion. Unfortunately, with diminishing returns, you normally won't go to sort of the extension that you got the last cycle. So I do not think we will make it to the 4.236 this cycle, which would be about 10 trillion. But I do think the asset class will make it to 10 trillion. Will make it to 10 trillion. I just don't know if it's going to happen this cycle or not, right? Like we might have to wait until next. Like we might get close, and then maybe we get our 2026 bear market, and then we go up to 10 trillion by 2028 or something, right? Like I don't know. I think we are going to 10 trillion. It's just like when's it going to happen? One of the reasons why it's hard for it to, again, anything's possible. One of the reasons it's hard for it to happen this cycle is because arguably, if it is a 4-year cycle, we only have 3.5 more months, right? So the market really needs to start moving if it's going to happen. It's not that it can't, it could. It's just like we would have to start doing something that we haven't really done this cycle. And that's just go parabolic, right? Like Bitcoin hasn't really done that as much this cycle. It's been more of a slow I mean, look at this cycle compared to last cycle, right? Where it was basically just up only.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah, and anything's possible, so I don't want to say it can't happen, but like to give you an idea of what I mean, like when I'm looking at total market cap, look at Bitcoin, and you can kind of look at the same idea. Like if you look at the first cycle, you can see that we went way above, right? Like way above any extensions. But then if you go to like the next cycle, still above it. Next cycle, we hit the 3.618, right? Yeah. So it got lower than the cycle before that, and then this cycle. We're already, obviously we've already broken a new all-time highs. So, we've already passed the 1.618. So the next level, so I would say for Bitcoin, we're probably not going to the 3.618. Probably not, because that's where we were last cycle, and we would expect some form of diminishing returns. Is the 2.618 possible? Yeah, like that's possible.
Where does that put us at for Bitcoin?
About 150. Plus or minus about 150. I mean, again, it's not like it has to happen, but it is possible. And the way I would play this is, I am just more so looking at like risk metrics and like volatility and euphoria. We're not really in that right now. Like we're not really seeing euphoria. The fear and greed index is I think it's kind of low right now. Like if you look at fear and greed, it can't be that high. Yeah, I mean it's neutral right now. It's only at 53. And then of course, if you look at some of the risk stuff, you can see that we're not really in the euphoric times.
No.
But so here's how I would play it, right? We have about 3.5 more months, historically of potentially good price action. The market cycle could end as early, as October, or as late as December is kind of how I see it. Sometime between October and December, I think it makes sense to start becoming cautious once we get into Q4. And if it's mid-December and Bitcoin and the euphoria still hasn't returned, then I would start to question if it's going to, right? But at this point, like there's still a chance that it might come back. And remember, it has this entire cycle, it's paid to be optimistic as long as we've continued our weekly closes above the 50-week moving average. Historically, once you get those closes below the 50-week, it means the cycle is over, right? It means the cycle is over. And every single time, we have not had that yet this cycle. Now, the 50-week moving average is currently at around $98,000. So, I will still lean optimistic and call for the, you know, for Bitcoin season and whatnot, as long as we're above that 50-week SMA. But whenever we drop below it on weekly closes, I think it makes sense to pivot quickly and say, look, that could be it, and we need to prepare for the bear market when that happens. But we haven't seen it yet. We've had a couple of close calls, right? We had one in September 2024. We had one in April. I even think wasn't I on your channel?
Yep.
And I think I said, like, as long as we hold the 2024 high, we should go to new all-time highs on this drop. And so now we're kind of seeing something similar, right? Where we're trying to hold these highs, right? We're trying to hold the January highs as support. And as long as those hold, then we should go to new all-time highs. Once again, I just think that we're going through this brutal September month, and normally in the month of September, Bitcoin just tries to hold the 20-week moving average, right? You can look at 2020. You know, 2020 is actually a really close carbon copy of what we've seen so far. Like, look at the pattern, right? You have a low in Q1, you go up, and then you go sideways until the 21-week EMA catches up. Then you pop up, go sideways, and then back down, and then you test that 20-week SMA for the entire month of September, right? So it's the same thing, right? You have a low in the Q1, early Q2, you go up, then you go sideways until the 21-week EMA catches up, sideways, back down. So I think right now we're basically in this area, right? We're in that area. So I think Bitcoin, I mean, obviously investors are hopeful that we're going to coil up and go into the final rally into the market cycle top. Yeah. But I will say, like, I think that should be the base case, right? Absolutely, that should be the base case. But if that actually starts to happen, just remember the top could occur at any moment, right? Because no one's going to tell, like, no one's going to be like, this is the top, you know, like everyone's just going to be euphoric if we start to see a move up. And so what I started looking at a little closer recently, just because we've started to get closer potentially to the end. As you look at like the ROI from the low, you can see we're currently on day 1,041 of the cycle. Last cycle ended on day 1,059, which is only 8 days. But the cycle before that ended on day 1,067, right? Which that would put you closer to mid-October. So I would say, look, by mid-October, we at least have to ask ourselves, could that be it? Mm-hmm. And if it is, who knows? And the other thing too is, in terms of like patterns and whatnot, Bitcoin tends to repeat patterns. There's two ways you can look at this, right? You can say, all right, well, in 2017, it was a December top. In 2021, it was a November top. Maybe this one is an October top, right? So we go December, November, October. Every cycle, it comes 1 month earlier just to throw people off. But the counterpoint to that is the cycle before was November. So maybe it just goes November, December, November, December. Mm-hmm. Structurally speaking, there are a lot of similarities between this cycle and the 2017 cycle. We even have the same president, right? I mean, Trump was also president in 2017. So good chance you'll see a top either October or December, would be my guess. And the way it would work out is, if it's an October top, then you could have a November alt season, right? If it's a December top, then what will happen is you'll get one more fake alt season before the real one, right? And that's essentially what happened in 2017. Like, if you look at Bitcoin dominance in 2017, you can see the narrative exactly how it played out. Like, you see how dominance rallied, right? Mm-hmm. It bottomed in September, and then it rallied into late October. And then you had a massive move down by dominance in the first week of November. And everyone thought it was alt season. I know, because I did too. And then you still had one more Bitcoin dominance rally, right? Yep. And then you finally had the top end. So for everyone who wants alt season to happen, remember the better alt seasons come, normally closer to the end of the year. And then also they come from higher Bitcoin dominance levels, right? Like, the higher dominance is, the better the alt season that you can get. Mm-hmm. So I would say, you'll either you probably will see dominance drop a lot in November. I think dominance will be green in September, so it should be green this month. It'll go up a lot in October. It'll drop a lot in November. And if the cycle top for Bitcoin is in October, that's all we get, right? And we're happy that it happened, and we move on to the next cycle. If we can get one more dominance rally, it's possible for it to go up one final time in early December. But even if it does go up in early December, I still think dominance will probably drop by then. Because even if dominance rallies for like the first week or two of December, it'll probably drop for the rest of December. So that's kind of how I see this cycle playing out. And then if it does play out like that, then it just kind of nicely sets up the a 2026 bear market. We consolidate, we get all the crap out, all the fluff, and we repeat our cycle in 2027.
What are the kind of things, we've gotten kind of the assumption that potentially the cycle tops out in either October or December, but what are you going to be looking at the closest to try to figure out either consolidate back into Bitcoin or take profits into stablecoin? And actually, if you get a good hunch or a feeling, or your data tells you that you believe that the cycle is coming toward an end, how are you going to play that? Are you going to take profits into stablecoin, or going to go to Bitcoin, or what?
I would consolidate altcoins back into Bitcoin, right? So like if you own altcoins, if you own Ethereum, by the end of the year or early 2026, I would go back to Bitcoin at the very least. I do think it makes sense to have at least 30% cash going into the midterm year in case it does end up being a bear market. You at least want to have something to be able to buy the dip with. I'm using this is a risk level for Bitcoin. It's pretty neutral right now. It's between 0.5 and 0.6 risk. So normally this spikes, and when it spikes, it sets up the market cycle top, and then the bear market happens. That hasn't happened yet this cycle. The best time for it to happen would be in Q4, right? So if it happens in Q4, then that'll make it really easy, because if we start screaming higher in Q4, for me, it'll just be simple. Like, all right, this time's not different. I'll take profits back to stables, and maybe wait until mid 2026 to get interested again.
Right.
What's going to be harder is if it doesn't spike, right? And it just kind of like you see this like move in 2019 where like the risk went up, but then it ended up going back all the way down because we went into a recession. Like that would be the harder pill to swallow. And I'm not really prepared to swallow that pill right now. Right? I feel like there's still reason to be optimistic as long as Bitcoin is holding those prior highs, as long as we're above the 50-week SMA, and as long as we're still looking at potentially Bitcoin dominance surging in October. It seems reasonable to hope for another surge by the risk metric to the upside. Where it becomes tricky is if we're sitting here in mid-December and we're still at 0.5 risk, right? What happens then? Like, does everyone just give up and say, all right, it wasn't meant to be this cycle? Do your friends get it right and that are calling for a longer cycle into 2026, right? Maybe that's what has to happen, is everyone gives up and then you finally get the spike to the higher risk levels. But for me personally, I use the risk metric. If we're still not spiking to the higher risk levels by the end of the year, I would probably have to assume that something is keeping that from happening, right? And already with diminishing returns, like we've seen much lower returns this cycle. I mean, to give you an idea of just how muted these returns have been, look at 2017. So the low from 2017, because Bitcoin also had a correction in 2017 where it tested the 2016 high, right? Sorry, I'm looking at the here. There's the 2016 high. So the 2016 high is right here, right? So in early 2017, you see how Bitcoin got the same correction and tested it, just like we did this cycle where Bitcoin tested the 2024 high in 2025, right? So very similar setup. But what's different is that the rally from that low into the August top for Bitcoin back in 2017, it was over a 500% rally, right? It was like a 540% rally. But from this low into the August top, it was only like a 60% rally, right? So it's, you're looking at basically an entire order of magnitude difference in the level of the rally that we got. And that's kind of like just like a sobering smack in the face, I guess, to just realize, just how different that's been. So everyone's waiting on a similar move. And it very well could happen, right? Like it certainly still could. I'm just saying, if it doesn't happen by the end of the year, then I feel like me, and I have to assume some other people too, would start to wonder if it's actually going to this cycle or not.
What I was just thinking about, that's I I think a lot different about this cycle too is just maybe another reason it feels a little bit more boring too is that we haven't really had, all these kind of 30 to 40% pullbacks that we've had in previous cycles, right? Like we're getting like on Bitcoin, at least as far as it's concerned, we are getting like 10, 15, maybe 20% max pullbacks.
Right.
We haven't seen like any of these 40% pullbacks, right?
I think the largest we had was over here, and it was barely a 30% drop. You want to see an interesting chart, actually? I think you might like this chart because that was a really good point. Let's look at days since Bitcoin had a 50% drop, right? What cycle does this look like? It looks like the 2016, 2017 cycle, right?
Yeah.
Like, because that's the only other cycle where Bitcoin went over 1,000 days without a 50% drop, right? And it looks like that's what we're potentially coming into here.
How many days has it been?
Well, right now it's been 1,041.
Wow.
In 2017, it topped. The market cycle topped on basically a day 1,070. So about it again. It puts us in October. But then the drop, the 50% drop, didn't happen until a little bit later on, like a few months later. Like it took until I think 2018 until you actually had the 50% drop. But the top occurred sooner than that, right? So we're coming up on that in about a month, right? Mid-October. That's why for me, like once we get to mid-October, like I have to force myself to think maybe that's it, right? Even though I don't want it to be, I have to force myself as early as mid-October to think maybe that's it. Hopefully we get another move in December, but we have to take it one step at a time.
Ben, all of these charts and everything that you've been showing us so far have all been in your Into the Cryptoverse kind of toolkit, right?
Yeah. We have a lot of charts over there.
For folks who just maybe you could just do a shameless plug real quick and let people know, because it's like all very fascinating stuff. And so if someone's watching this and wants to know how to get access to all of these and how to use everything that you've been showing us, how do they do that?
Yeah, just go to intothecryptoverse.com. I also talk a lot about it just on my my channel. Just after my name, Benjamin Cowen. But yeah, I mean, like, and we have a free tier as well where people can get access to a lot of the charts for free. I mean, not all of them, of course, but we also have, I don't really talk a whole lot about altcoins. Like, I more so focus on the majors like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and whatnot. I don't really got on the list, but we do have this like asset filter where, you can go in here and pick different altcoins to basically look at. And if you do that, it'll then pull up the charts that we have just for that altcoin, right? So, if there are some altcoins that you're interested in, that is at least one way you can get some data behind it. But, for me, I feel like the longer you're in the cycles, the more you just sort of defer towards Bitcoin, to be completely honest.
Well, I think maybe you could just pull up something on Solana real quick and show us a little bit about like how that would work, because I'm doing a show on Solana soon, and just there's a lot of talk about the ETFs. You just had that digital asset treasury company buy like 1.6 billion on it, and so it seems to be kind of like on the timeline.
Here's like the Solana running 1 year ROI, right? Here's a good a nice chart. If you look at, I think we have a risk metric for Solana as well. So the risk metric for Solana right now is about 0.695, right? So it's getting up there. It's not like as high as it was last cycle, but it's pretty elevated. But again, it's not as elevated as some of other things we've seen. XRP was a coin that I think people keep thinking it's going to go. Like I see all these like crazy price predictions.
Yeah.
But it is already in the 0.7 to 0.8 risk band. It doesn't mean it can't go higher. It could, but just know that if it gets that final spike up, like it did all these other cycles, that's probably it, right?
Yeah.
So you could see how we could put a bow on the cycle for a lot of these altcoins, even for Ethereum, right? You could see how we could put a bow on it, just get that final spike up to the higher risk bands, and let's just call it a day. Let's enjoy 2026 doing our other hobbies, and we'll come back at the end and repeat this whole thing, right? So I feel like you could visualize how the cycle might end. It's just a matter of does it play out between now and the rest of the year?
Yeah. All right, Ben. Amazing. Thank you so much for everything. Really fascinating and helps a lot. I've been wanting to get my audience up to date on some technicals and see how things are playing out, get a different perspective from the other mega bulls who are looking at fundamentals and just have a sense check, reality check here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. A pleasure to be here as always. And hopefully we can catch up again in a few months.
Sure. Thanks, Ben.
See ya.